Hey there nation, and welcome to the show where we help you to play miniatures wargaming on a budget. It is I, Commander Cheapskate, and welcome to Cheap Shots, the ultimate series for miniature wargamers who want to paint stunning tabletop quality miniatures without breaking the bank. In this series, I'll show you how to save money on your miniature painting hobby by using affordable craft paints, budget-friendly tools, and clever techniques. So whether you're a beginner or a seasoned hobbyist, you'll learn how to achieve incredible results without the premium price tag. And on today's video, we're going to show you guys how to paint up the Shadeborn warband for your games of Warhammer Underworlds. As you can see in this image, this is the end result of what your miniatures will look like, and by following the tips and techniques as well as materials that we suggest, we can help you save over $127.49 to paint your miniatures like this. As you can see, these guys look bright and beautiful, and they're going to look amazing on the tabletop. So with that being said, let's talk about how to paint these characters up, both quickly and more importantly, cheaply. So the first thing you have to do, of course, is to assemble your miniatures, and these are push-fit miniatures, so they're very quick to assemble. You just got to follow the instructions from the box. And the nice thing about these miniatures as well is that the bases are actually fully sculpted as well as textured for you, so we don't have to do that part at all. We can just totally skip that step. The last thing we got to do, of course, is to spray our miniatures with some primer, and primer is a very important step because it creates a surface for your acrylic paints to adhere to. Unfortunately, if you were to take your acrylic paints and put it directly onto bare plastic, the slightest bit of friction will cause the acrylic paint to rub off your miniature, which of course would ruin the overall finish. So priming prevents that from happening. The second thing that priming also does as well is it has a large impact on the vibrancy and the value of the colors that you have on your miniatures. Traditionally speaking, the brighter the paint job that you want to have, the lighter the primer you want to use. In this case, since we're going to use an oil wash to darken down the miniatures, we're going to use an all-over spray of Rust-Oleum flat white primer. You can get it at your local Walmart. We're just going to put a thin coat of primer all over the entirety of the miniature and ready to start putting on our base coats. So the very first detail we're going to paint on these miniatures are on the flesh, and luckily for us there is not much of exposed flesh on these miniatures. Primarily the midriff, the arms, as well as the faces and hands are all that's really exposed. So in order to bring out that detail, we're going to put two thin coats of Peaches and Cream by Delta Ceramcoat. It's a very pale flesh color that you can get at your local Hobby Lobby. We're just going to put two thin coats of this directly onto the flesh of the miniatures. You don't need to be particularly neat at this point, just make sure you got a good solid base coat and all the exposed flesh on the Shadeborn. So next thing we're going to paint are the clothing that they have, so things like the sashes as well as the tops that they have. They have like these cloth wraps surrounding their bodies. Now, I will admit right off the bat, when I originally started painting these miniatures, I used Concord Grape Apple paint. You can get it at your local Hobby Lobby, local Walmart for about 58 cents. And I'm going to admit, I didn't like the way that this color looked as the rest of the color scheme. I thought it was too bright, so I'm going to change my mind later on by painting over it with some Wild Iris. But the nice thing about the cheapskate method, of course, is that the paints are so cheap that if you make a mistake like this, or if you decide to change your mind, you can do so without breaking the bank. So at the time, I decided to do a dry brush on the Concord Grape that I did earlier, so just going to do a quick dry brushing real quick of some Lilac Mist by Apple paint. We're going to dry brush all the purple materials that we did before, and for the long-haired fighters in the back, we're going to put that as a base coat directly onto their hair to kind of create this nice little vibrant kind of lilac look when it comes to their hair, like this lavender kind of pinkish purplish color. So just put two thin coats of that directly onto their hair, and ready to move on to our next step. So the next detail we're going to paint are things like their trousers as well as their cloaks. And to bring out that detail, we're going to put two thin coats of Tuscan Teal by Apple paint, and then we're going to dry brush that real quick with some Dutch Aqua by some Folk Art. Now, dry brushing is a really important step in miniature painting because what it does, it creates the illusion of depth on your miniature by creating highlights. What ends up happening is the pigments of the paint adhere to the raised surface on your miniature while leaving that darker color in the recesses. As you can see, we see a lot of the folds of the fabric that we really couldn't see earlier. Now, if you'll notice as well, there's also a little bit of a chalky kind of pastel appearance when you do dry brushing. That's perfectly fine. When we do the oil washing phase, it's going to smooth out that transition and take away that chalky appearance. So if you see that, don't stress out. It's all part of the process. And it was at this point that I looked at my miniatures, I realized that the purple wasn't vibrant enough, and this is where I decided to make a judgment call and to change up and use a different color of purple for their clothing. So I decided to go back to the clothing, this time using Wild Iris, which is a dark, deep purple color that you can get at your local Walmart, and I applied two thin coats as a base coat all over the clothing that I did earlier in Concord Grape. And I was much happier with this look because it's a nice contrast to the turquoise that we have on the miniatures. At the same time, it also makes the hair kind of stand out on its own as its own individual detail. I really like the way this looked a lot more, and I decided to move on with the dry brushing for the purple. And once again, I decided to go back to Lilac Mist and do dry brushing on the part that I did in Wild Iris, and I was much happier with the end result with that contrast between the purple as well as with the turquoise that we used earlier. At the same time, the Lilac Mist is kind of like its own detail as well, and I was very satisfied with the end result. So now that we're done painting their clothing, the next thing we're going to focus on next is on the leather goods on their weapons. So the next detail we focus on are on the leather goods, things like their boots, as well as any kind of arm greaves and leg greaves that they have, as well as any leather harnesses and straps that they have on their body. We're also going to pick out the detail of the handle of the double-ended spear and the fire on the back, as well as that weird looking kind of moonstone looking sickle thing and blade that's being carried by the leader of this warband as well. It kind of looks like obsidian to me, so because I decided to pick down 2 thin layers of pavement paint, which you get at your local Walmart. So after you get a good solid base coat, the next thing we're going to do now is a dry brush. So for all the leather goods that we picked out earlier in pavement paint, we're going to dry brush that with some pale gray by folk art. So things like the boots, the straps, the arm greaves, that sort of thing, the handle of the two-handed spear, those kind of details. Now as for the sickle blade, as well as the jagged dagger thing carried by the source from the background, we're going to dry brush that with some Dutch aqua because I want to make it look like some kind of weird kind of stone, obsidian, mythical crystal type thing. And then once we're done with that dry brushing, we start moving on to the metallic elements. The first metallic element we're going to focus on first is on the gold details on these miniatures, specifically on some of the armor panels these characters are wearing, so like the sorcerer with their chest rig, as well as their crown, the hilts and handles of their weapons, the armor on the staff, for example, as well as the kneecaps, their breastplates, the emblems, as well as the weapons. So all the details that we want to be gold, we're going to pick down 2 thin layers of Emperor's Gold by Deco Art. You can get this at your local Walmart for about 99 cents. It's a nice, rich, dark gold color that is proximate to the same kind of value as a Retributor armor is, but a heck of a lot cheaper. So there's been 2 thin layers of that gold element to create that nice contrast with the teals as well as the purples. We're ready to move on to our next metallic element. And that metallic element is going to be Anniversary Silver. We're going to focus this primarily on the masks that's being worn by the sorcerer character in the background, as well as the archer who's kind of crouching. They got these kind of mirror masks on their faces. So to bring out that detail, we're going to put 2 thin layers of Anniversary Silver by Folk Art. It's a nice, super bright silver that kind of like has like a bluish tinge to it. We're just going to add that directly onto their face masks. We're going to move on to our next metallic detail. And that last metallic detail is going to be the blades of the weapons, as well as some armor panels for some of these characters as well. And for that color, we're going to use Folk Art's Gunmetal Gray. It's a beautiful dark gunmetal color that you can get at your local Walmart for about 78 cents. And we're going to pick out all the blades around these characters, things like spines, hooks, as well as the blades of their weapons, as well as some of the mechanical work on the repeater crossbow on the guys crouching right in front of us. And once we get all those silver elements done, the next thing we're going to work on are some of the fine detail, like the jewelry. So these characters do have some gemstones on their person, so to bring out that detail, we're going to use green turquoise by Albemarle Paint. We're just going to put thin little dots of this directly onto their, for example, like the brooches that they're wearing on their chest rigs, the gems hanging off of the staff, as well as the vein running through the crystal bladed thing that's used by the sorcerer. We're just going to look for those details that we want to have in that turquoise color because it's a nice contrast to all the gold that we have. And once we're done with that, we're ready to move on to our oil wash. Now normally I like to do an oil wash with the base as well as the miniatures themselves, but I'm going to do something differently with the bases. I want to make them look like they're underwater, like these guys are attacking from the sea. So because that, we're going to use Midwax Polyshade and Mission Oak directly all over the entirety of the miniature. Now a lot of people like to use Army Painter Strong Tone for this step, which is perfectly fine because it's a beautiful product that does exactly as advertised. The only problem though is it is quite expensive at $37 a can, while Midwax Polyshade and Mission Oak only cost about $6.99 at your local Walmart. What we're going to do is we're going to apply this like a wash all over the entirety of the miniature, and the wash is going to do a couple of things. The first thing that's going to do is going to seep directly into the recesses of the miniature and bring out a lot of those details that we couldn't see before. Things like the individual folds of the fabric, the musculature of their bodies, the strands of hair, that sort of thing. The second thing the oil wash also does too is it smooths out the transitions between our base coats as well as our dry brushing. So if you'll notice that kind of pastel look is kind of gone now, and that chalky texture is completely disappeared because our base coats and our dry brushes have now been smoothed out with those transitions. And the last thing that the oil wash also does too is it also darkens the value of the color that we use on our miniatures. That's why we use such bright and vibrant colors beforehand, because we're taking into account that the oil stain is going to stain that and make it darker. Now you do have to wait for this stuff to dry and cure for about 24 hours because there is polyurethane mixed with it, so you will have a high gloss finish on these miniatures that will protect your miniatures from chipping as well as fading. So my suggestion to you is to use this as the very last step of your painting process and then return back to the next day to continue on painting. Alright, so it's been 24 hours and the Midwax has dried and cured, and the next thing we're going to do real quick is start working on the bases. Now the bases are heavily textured. There's a lot of details like masonry and bones and all kinds of different things. However though, we're not going to really pay too much attention to that, and the reason why is because I want these Dark Elves to match up with my Dark Elf army that I have for my Warhammer Fantasy Battle. In my Warhammer Fantasy Battle army for Dark Elves, I have this kind of ocean looking base on them where it looks like they're coming out of the sea and attacking you, so in order to create that same look, I'm going to apply that directly to these characters. That way I can use them as shades or skirmishers for my Warhammer the Old World army. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put 2 thin coats of bright blue over the entirety of the bases, no matter what the sculpturing looks like, because I want to make it look like it's kind of like underwater and these guys are walking over the ruins of like a beach or like a beachhead of some sort or along the coast. After that, we're going to dry brush the bases real quick with some Dutch Aqua to bring out those textures that we see before, so you can see things like bones and bits of armor and weaponry and all kinds of stuff. So it looks like these guys are kind of like walking along a coastline or a beachhead where some battles are taking place in the ancient past, and it looks like it's completely underwater as well. The next step we're actually going to do before we actually work on the bases, because I want to give the bases a high gloss finish to make it look like it's wet. What I'm going to do is I'm going to spray my miniatures down with a matte varnish first. Now this step is of course completely optional, but the reason why I did is so that we could take out that high gloss finish on the miniatures, because I like more of a matte finish on my miniatures. So I use some Krylon matte varnish spray that I buy at Walmart. Just do it once over real quick to take off the sheen from the polyurethane, and then we're going to start working back on the bases again with a high gloss coating. Now, another thing about Minwax is that they also make another polyacrylic that is also clear without any coloring whatsoever. And in fact, it's a high gloss varnish that you can put on your mint bases. So that's exactly what I'm going to do. I'm going to use that product and apply it directly onto the bases to give it a high gloss finish to make it look like what they're walking on is that the bases are kind of wet and underwater as well. Now, you will need to let this stuff dry and cure for 24 hours. And once you're done, we got to rim the bases and we're done. So the color I used to rim the bases is some Laguna Beach by Apple Barrel Paint. Just put 2 thin coats of that directly around the rim of the bases to kind of match the rest of my Dark Elf army, and these miniatures are completely finished. Alright, so there you guys go. This is the end result of our miniatures. As you can see, I have a beautiful tabletop standard and they're ready to throw down in your games of Warhammer Underworlds, Warhammer Age of Sigmar, or in my case, I'm going to use them for Mordheim as part of a Dark Elf warband. At the same time, our cheapskate method only costs a grand total of $4.26 in order to do this as well. So now that we're going to talk about the materials that we use from our cheapskate method to paint up these miniatures, let's talk about exactly what you need to get from Citadel as well as Army Painter if you want to achieve the exact same results we did, but using those name brand paints instead. Alright, so these are the paints that you use from both Citadel as well as Army Painter if you want to achieve the exact same results we did, but with using these name brand paints instead. You buy a can of Corax White Spray for $24, as well as Thunderhawk Blue, Nagaroth Night, Temple Guard Blue, Genestealer Purple, Delicala Lilac, Teclis Blue, Eshin Grade, Flavon Fresh, as well as Ulthuan Gray, and each of those costs $4.55. You also need to buy a pot of Pterodon Turquoise, Leadbelcher, Ironbreaker, Aethermatic Blue, Retributor Armor, and Ard Coating, which all cost $7.80. You also need to buy a can of Army Painter Strong Tone for $32, as well as Munitarian Varnish for $24. So assuming that you're purchasing everything for the very first time from both Citadel as well as Army Painter, you're talking about a grand total investment of $167.75. And when you compare that with our cheapskate method of only $4.26, you have the grand total savings of $127.49. So there you guys have it. This is how you guys can quickly as well as easily paint up your guys' Shadeborn warbands for your games of Warhammer Underworlds. If you're looking for a way to save some money, may I suggest switching to cheaper craft paints. After all, you achieve the exact same results, if not similar results, if not exact same results, but for a fraction of the price. As always, guys, please feel free to like, comment, and or subscribe. You guys' input is invaluable to us as always. Also check us out on Facebook, Instagram, as well as blogger.com for all the latest greatest hobby news related to this channel. I am Commander Cheapskate. I'll catch you guys next video. Peace out and stay classy.